Welcome to this workshop. My name is Michael Cook. I'll introduce myself further in a moment, but I just want to make sure. This is how to build an icon, the basics, a material design icon. Hopefully everybody is in Figma, the tool that we'll be using to design today. If people are watching on the stream or in the future, you can visit this link, cookicons.co/workshop, to get to the public design file. We're all in a private design file. And in the future, you can access an individual icon design template at cookicons.co/icon template. And from there, you'll be able to have your own individual icon template where you'll have resources and the things that we'll go over if you wish to make icons in the future. All right, and if anybody comes in the future during this talk, please let them know the private link, and then they can get on board. So this workshop is going to hop back and forth between some live demonstration by me, a few short slides, and then a period of time where I will set you free to employ the things that I have shown you, and I will be milling around to offer assistance during that time, answer questions, or just work myself in the front of the room to give you something to watch. We're going to hop over to the other screen. And now we are in Figma. Figma is the design tool that we'll be using for our workshop material design product icons. I'm Michael Cook. I'm an interface and icon designer. I live in small town Fairfield, Iowa. In addition to my interface design, I do these app icons. You may have seen some of them, including Phonograph, the music app, Monospace, the text editor, Slide for Reddit, and the Popcorn Time icon, rest in peace. I am also working to assemble a group of freelancers who specialize in material design and want to take on client work individually or as a team. If you're interested as a developer or a designer, let me know. I'm going to zoom out a little bit to take a look at what we've got here. So this is our workspace in Figma. This is a new service that has just publicly launched in beta a day ago, and we are right on the cutting edge of this. We will be simultaneously working here. We can already see some of the other folks are in here. What people can do is if they want to follow me around, they can click on my name at the top. And from there, they'll go into a preview mode where they can follow me around and all of my movements to keep up with what I'm doing. That way you don't get lost. Because I'll be moving around this space to build my icon and then familiarize with you so that you can build your icon when I'm done. Figma is a really interesting tool if you're familiar with Illustrator or Sketch. It is in many ways synonymous to that with some interesting perks. As was recently added in Sketch to keep up, Figma, besides just being an impressive interface vector design tool, has some interesting responsive features. So within an artboard, I can set parameters and behaviors of the elements inside of it to give it an interesting, flexible nature. That's just a side note. What I want to jump into now is creating a very basic material design app icon, go through the specifications, identify the places where they're wrong, and then provide some insights to understand it. And then I'll introduce some slides where I'll cover some principles and practices on a more conceptual level. Then we'll leave it to you guys and gals to make your own icons. So here is the icon template for material design. It is comprised of an 8-pixel, or in this case, 8 DP grid. Pixels being the units of design measurements that we're using now, DP being a density-independent pixel, which is designed to scale across different densities of screens. This may be redundant for some of you at this point. We're going to be designing at XXXH DPI, 192 pixels in this situation. We will get to the export sizes and functionality at the end to wrap up my demonstration. Similar to iOS, there is some key lines present, the diagonals, some verticals, and then there are these 4 shapes, these keyline shapes within this grid meant to kind of create guidances for how to size common shapes. And uncommon shapes would find themselves amongst these spaces. But the important thing would be the outer edges of it, which leave 16 pixels gap for the largest object. We have a circle, a square, horizontal, and portrait rectangles. Down here we have our resources. I'm going to get started with the backgrounds. So there are a handful of these common background patterns presented in the guidelines by Google and utilized in their own icons that I've kind of combined. These are all fully editable. I'm going to start with the basic square, but these can be here for you to play with. I'm going to recreate everything from the beginning to walk you through creating things in Figma. So on the left, if you're familiar with design software, is the layer list, and on the right is the attributes panel that will provide values and ways to modify objects that are selected. I'm going to select this artboard, or group as it's called in Figma. In Figma, they've merged groups and frames into a single object that can both adjust its size to fit the dimensions of all the objects inside of it, or have an arbitrarily set size like we have now. So I'm going to start by creating the background object, and this time we'll do a square. Up here is the Create Square tool. I can also hit R. And I'm going to start in the center and hold Shift. I'm going to click and then hold Shift and Alt. And that will allow me to scale out a shape. And I'm both recording this and live streaming, so this is going to be exciting. I don't need to get exact, even though I did. 152 pixels is the common dimension for a square icon. In fact, if you have a square icon that is larger than that, some people in this room will shrink it if you're using their launchers. So please respect these boundaries. If you make your icon bigger, it ruins it for everybody else. It's very rude, and Duarte would not be pleased. So we have our square now. All icons, the boundaries tend to be rounded corners, and the value for the rounded corners of a square is 12 pixels. So in the attributes panel of this square, this little corner icon indicates that that is the corners, and it will apply to all the corners. If you need to apply things individually, you can double-click on a shape to enter the vertex mode, where you can access each point of the shape and assign individual curve values. You're welcome to prance in front of the screen, but we'll see your name. Now that we've got the shape and the whoever's purple, can you unclick from my square? Oliver, thanks, Oliver.
Got it.
No worries. Oh, one thing, I'm off center. If I'm holding Alt and I have an object selected, it will tell me its distance from various things around it. I'm off center. I can either move it manually, or I have these alignment tools. I can center horizontally and vertically, and now we're good. Now we're going to color it using the colors from the material palette. These colors are useful to start with if you have no brand colors existing. I think I'm going to make a replacement for the Audible icon simply, crudely, because while their app has improved greatly, the icon is currently leaves some to be desired. So I'm going to grab this orange color. This is in a nest of groups, and I've hit Control-click to dig through all the groups and select this object individually. It has a fill element, and I can actually select that fill element and copy it. I could also double-click to get the hex value. I'm going to just grab that, and I'm going to move back to, oh gosh, there it is. Move back to my square, and I hit paste, and I did the square. There we go. So I can transfer fills and strokes and effects from one object to another through that selection mechanism. Now we have our square, but we're going to add our first layer effects. Material design is big on depth and elevation and the shadows cast from them. As you see over here, a typical icon is comprised of a handful of components. There's the base background layer, often a foreground element, and then a finished lighting on top of it. We're going to include specs for a long shadow, which is common but not documented, which implies that maybe Google perhaps assumes that it's not required, but that they choose to do it, and they're letting us fend for ourselves. But we're going to get onto the things that we do know about, which is the effects. We know about, from the guidelines, that there should be a highlight on the top, a shaded edge on the bottom, and we know from the launchers and the icons that are on our home screen that there is a drop shadow over the entire icon, a silhouette shadow, but that is curiously undocumented, and I'm going to provide my recommendation in Sketch or Figma for the recommended values for this drop shadow. In Illustrator, it's weird, and I can't help you there. Over on the Attributes panel, still with our thing selected, I'm going to add an effect. The default is a drop shadow, which is great. I can click on the icon to get into the attributes of this effect specifically. It has a blur value, an X offset, a Y offset, a color, transparency, and a blending property. Blending property should be normal. The blur and Y value are great. The X value is great. We want 4 pixels of blur, 0 X offset, and 4 Y offset. The color black for this is also fantastic, but we want to change the opacity to 20%. This is an estimate. It's not exact, but this is from just comparing eye to eye what seems most likely. That's the first drop shadow. A second drop shadow then occurs that has no Y offset. So for this one, we're simply going to take away the Y offset and set our opacity back to 0. This helps create a small amount of shadow at the top of the icon and is especially valuable if your icon is a very light color or especially white. It will add some dimension because in some situations on light wallpapers, that icon's going to disappear. So we have our silhouette shadow comprised of 2 drop shadows, which is actually similar to how shadows are cast in the interface of Android with 2 independent drop shadows. Now we're going to add a highlight to the top and a little shaded edge to the bottom through the use of inner shadows, also not similar on Illustrator, but much easier to accomplish in Sketch and Figma. For these, we're going to switch from a drop shadow to an inner shadow. I'm explaining this too fast. Don't worry. After I'm done, I'll go through and help all of you, and it's recorded. So if you're not keeping up, that's okay. Blur goes down to 0. Y offset goes to 1, and that gives us our top highlight, except it's dark. In the context of material design, we've got this kind of vague top light and then a strong side light, which will cast the long shadow, which is explicitly mentioned in the guidelines, and yet the long shadow itself is not, Google. This is going to be changed the color from a dark to a white all the way. 20% similarly is good, though on light colors, I ramp it up, especially if it's very light. So this is starting from 20% and then moving somewhere approximate to there. We're going to do a second one for the bottom edge. For this one, we also want blur 0. The Y offset now needs to be -1, so it's coming from the bottom. For the color, though, it's going to get a bit complicated. The fast, cheap way to do it is to have it black, but a big beauty of icons in material design is that they use these nice shade colors to have a much more rich, natural lighting feel. So we're going to move over to our color resources, and we're going to remember Google provides kind of a simplified list of shade colors to use based on the color that your icon is. That often works, but feels often off, and I tend to just recommend using the 900 of whatever color it is that you're using. So I was using orange. I'm going to grab this 900 again by control-clicking to get through to it. I could also double-click into the object. So I'm going to grab this. Now I need the hex value in this situation, so I'm going to double-click that to copy. I'm going to move back, select my square. I have my inner circle, my inner shadow. And here in the color selector, I can paste in the hex value. And then let's zoom in on that for a nice shot to see how that feels. Oh, I've got a grid on that I'm going to take off for a moment. So now we've got a darker edge, which is a shade that matches the color instead of returning to a drab grayness. That's going to add a small amount of vibrancy and richness to the icon. After we've got our background established, which is done now, we're going to do a foreground shape. The foreground has similarities to the background object, but it gets a slightly different shadow treatment. And this is another area in which there's actually a discrepancy between what the guideline states and what Google actually does with their icons. So I'm going to present what Google actually does, which is instead of using the bottom shaded edge, there's actually a second single pixel drop shadow underneath it. Why they haven't updated the guidelines, I don't know. But it has been confirmed with a designer at Google that this is how they do their icons. So we've got a tinted edge like on the top of the orange square. We have a drop shadow similar to the background, except in this situation, our X offset is 4. This is something that Google does in their icons. I prefer not to because I think it just looks weird. So I usually have X offset of 0. And we can look at the differences. For this foreground object, we're going to now get into some symbolism, which is what icons are all about. So I provided a handy selection of the UI icons, the system icons provided by Google, to grab and use in your icon. They use them. They're freely available for us to use, and they're a great starting place either for placeholders or simple icons. I'm going to grab this book. In this situation, I'm double or control clicking to grab it, and I'm going to return to my shape, paste that in there. In this situation, I don't want the head. I'm going to delete that. From here, as I scaled the background, I'm going to hold Shift and Alt and click to drag. And that's going to scale it from the center, which will help it be centered. If things do get off center, like that, then I can use my alignment tools to make sure it's perfect. So to create good contrast, the common technique is for the top element to be full white. But if we want to apply some highlights to the top, it helps to make it a couple shades below white. The value that I usually use, which is the first shade of gray that allows a full white highlight to be perceptible, is F5, F5, F5. You can remember it by, that's what you use to refresh. Oh, so I've now made it a slight off-white, and I'm going to go through and add the same highlight. In this situation, I'm going to shortcut, and I'm going to grab it from the background tool, because I can copy that and paste that. Now it has the inner shadow. I'm also going to grab the first drop shadow. But in this situation, how's it going, Kevin? In this situation, because I have this drop shadow, is that even showing up? Oh, I'm on the wrong thing. There we go. This drop shadow is black, and we'll see that it looks garish, to say the least. So we're going to return to our shade value to make it look better. So I'm going to grab that shade value that I had over here. And then for this object, I'm going to change the shadow color to what I had before. And we can see it's a much more natural feeling color. I don't know if it's showing up here. It hopefully looks beautiful on your screen. We can go back and forth to see that improvement. So there's black, a shade color. If this feels too faint, just jump in there and make it darker. I start with these colors and then often modify them. I'm just going to do that arbitrarily. In this situation, I allow you to go out of spec. I authorize it. All right, now we need to do this weird contact shadow that is I don't know, outside of the verses, outside of Scripture. We're going to do as they do and not as they say in this situation. So I'm going to copy and paste that effects layer. You can't duplicate it for some reason, but you can copy and paste it. I want this to be a single... Oh, I didn't... I want this to be a single 0 blur and 1 Y. And that's going to create... Oh, I'm on the wrong thing. That's what's going on. Instead of 4 blur and 4 offset for the Y, I want 0 blur and 1 offset for the Y. And my interpretation of this would be that they are attempting to create a stronger, crisper distinction between the background and the foreground. It's very subtle, but it adds a slight element of dimension and richness to the icon. Foreground at this point is done. The two things left are casting a long shadow from it and then overlaying a final finish lighting to give texture and tactility to the icon. I'm going to move over here for the long shadow. The long shadow is this infamous 45-degree angle shadow that casts off anything we can get our hands on in terms of icons. You may have seen it across apps being poorly used or overly used or awkwardly used. In a moment, I'll provide some short advice for how to do it in the spirit of Duarte. But these are, again, because this is not actually in the Scripture, we have these approximated values. But it is essentially a shape that we will be making by hand that goes from the top left of the foreground element to the bottom right of the whole silhouette of the icon. It's at 45 degrees, and it's going to be a linear gradient from the shade color at 10% to the shade color at 0%. And we do this in some in tools such as Sketch. There are plugins that allow you to generate this. In code, it is possible to generate this. I'm going to teach us the old-fashioned way, which is to use the pen tool, like God intended. And I'm going to use a couple techniques to make it simpler, but I'm going to start approximate, and then we can smooth it out later. So I start by finding the bottom left corner, the bottom leftmost corner, and making my first click. With the pen tool, each successive click joins this shape in a line that will be closed into a shape. If I hold Shift, it confines it to 45 and 90-degree angles, so I can conveniently bring it down as close as I can get to the bottom. That's my first click. Bring it over to the corner. That's my second click. This becomes the most difficult to estimate. I want to kind of figure out where a 45-degree angle is going to hit that top rightmost corner. We'll say here. I nailed it. If I don't nail it, which I always do, I'm going to overshoot a bit just to make it simple to get it at the right point. Now I'm going to come back over and close the loop, and I have my shape. I'm going to switch back to the selection tool, grab both of these, and just move them up with the keyboard until it's good enough. To finish the icon, I would then go in and make sure everything was perfectly aligned. For this situation, and to just save us the time, we're just going to be approximate. That's pretty good. We always want to move in a diagonal way. So if you're using the keyboard, you hit down and right it simultaneously or alternate in sequence. I don't want to stroke, which is the default way that a pen-drawn shape is. I only want to fill. So I'm going to add a fill like I added effects, and I'm going to remove the stroke similar to how I added it. And we can see now that I didn't get it right. This is unacceptable. There we go. To round this off like the other ones, I'm just going to add a 12 radius to it, like we did with the square. This could also be masked out, but this is the basics, so we're not going to do that. You could see, though, that if there were more complicated shapes for the background, that it could be tedious to curve and define your shadow to conform to the background shape. So masks are required in that situation. So I want a gradient, which we haven't done yet. So I'm going to go into the color picker, and I'm going to switch from a solid to a linear gradient, which provides me with these ends of the spectrum. And this leftmost one kind of just wants to be where the top of the shadow is, and then constricting it to 45-degree angle with shift again, I'm going to bring this. In general, the shadows are brought all the way to the edge. The longer the shadow is, the earlier I like to terminate the gradient. So I'm going to pull it in, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20% to have a smoother ending. If the angles are really weird, sometimes you want to adjust the gradient angle just a little bit so that it can have a more even origin on both sides. Don't worry about that yet. In this situation, again, we want the shade values. I'm going to save some time and just approximate them by clicking there, going here. This is very unconventional, but we'll save time. I want to apply the same color to both ends of the spectrum. The opacity value for this side is correct at 0, but this one up here, the guidelines say 10%. I often find that 10% is way too low. Bear in mind that you don't want the long shadow to be offensively pronounced, but I often prefer a 20%, which also changes depending on the background color. Our final element in this is adding a finish layer, which is relatively simple. This finish layer adds a radial gradient of just pure white. We can see it originating from one corner to the other and casting subtle whiteness and lightness over the entire icon, which makes a flat icon feel slightly less flat, slightly more rich. I'm going to just grab this one here, and I'm going to duplicate the background layer so that I know that I'm applying this gradient to the exact same shape as the rest of the icon. I'm going to remove the effects, paste that, and then we'll compare the two in a moment to oohs and ahs. We don't need to ooh and ah. All right, so we now have without and with. You want to make sure that you're not diminishing or dulling the icon too much, so you can go somewhere between 10 and 20% for the opacity. But we have that there. This is a pretty bland icon. It's often valuable to incorporate some secondary element of symbolism, and we're going to do that using what Google refers to as spot color within the icon. Since this is for an audiobook, I'm going to just very crudely grab the volume icon. This finish layer is now in the way of everything, and every time you click on anything, it's going to assume you intended to click it. So I'm going to lock it to put it in its place, and then I'm going to paste this icon here. If I hover my mouse around the edges, I'll get this rotate cursor available, and I can hold shift to conform that to large increments. And in this situation, I'm going to use the same. I'm going to use a 700 or a slightly darker color than the background right here. Once we do this, I'm going to jump in and show you some slides. Where's my icon? All right. I'm going to scale this up a tad. Paste my color. This could also be a contrasting color if you want. We've now created a basic material design icon. This conforms and it exceeds the guidelines in all respects, and yet, in my opinion, it is lacking and crude and unimpressive. These types of icons can be great for very simple apps where a boisterous, profound icon is not appropriate, and it can be great for placeholders or to build momentum for an app. But ultimately, I think that we are unprepared now to make an icon. We can make the beginning of an icon, the infancy of an icon, but an icon could have more responsibility to this. It can be better, and it should be better. And in some situations, perhaps an icon does not require to be more, impressive. But it seems that more and more the responsibility of an icon as an ambassador or a salesperson or a convincer, an articulator of the feature set of an icon is becoming more and more important. The identity of the app itself becomes locked in to this small square that is the first thing someone will see when deciding which app to install. So I'm going to put forth that an icon can be more, and I'm going to present a short summary of some of the things that I've thought about when trying to pursue how to make a better icon. So now we're going to switch to a short presentation where we're going to look at excerpts of my principles and practices to make icons with integrity, richness, and the spirit of Duarte. Integrity being a strong, powerful, impressive icon, richness having nuance and a conveyance of value, and the spirit of Duarte being an icon that feels at home on Android, that feels in a likeness with the popular apps put forth by Google and other developers. And these are incomplete and a small summary. One of the ways to think about icons is three main groups. The one that we've made is a simple background shape with foreground symbolism. There are icons that are complex representations of objects or constellations of objects. And then there are icons that have abstract geometry that just convey a sense of some emotion or some feeling or some vague idea, but rely on just cleverness and aesthetic appeal. I believe that icons should strive for strong geometry to be at home in Android. We have some examples here, and I'm going to look closely at them. They don't need to have intense, perfect symmetry and geometry in all forms, but I'm going to highlight some elements where I've tried to strengthen relationships between elements within the icon to create a sense of integrity, which is considered by some designers and artists to be valuable to a viewer based on our tendency to appraise icons and designs as if we would appraise the integrity of an actual building, that being our maybe closest sense of quality of something. So if we can make an icon strong geometrically, the hope is to create a sense of strength visually and aesthetically. So for this icon, creating relationships between angles, pairing this long shadow with, pairing the grooves of the bag with the long shadow, having points of intersections be strong and similar, lining up angles and shapes, and having pieces generally fit together and feel as if they are aware of each other and their position. The simple act of combining shapes into a point of intersection to reinforce that edge, to make that edge more intentional and strong. To have consistency of widths and sizes, to have objects fit perfectly within a space as opposed to arbitrarily or organically. Organic beauty has its place in many aspects of design. The qualities and spirit of material design, as put forth by Google, lean towards strong geometry. In this situation, I've sized the text to intersect at a corner with the long shadow. In this situation, I've taken a complex organic object and reduced it into simple, primitive geometrical shapes to create, as I've said, a stronger composition. Not necessarily better than organic shapes, but more appropriate in this context. The phone icon itself is a great example of an arrangement of very simple shapes, being 3 circles to define the curves and a rectangle to create the center space. It's a beautiful, elegant, almost a poetic expression of an object. Making long shadows great again. Hashtag. But to be more specific, engaging in careful long shadow placement. If anybody's spent even a fraction of the time as I have staring at these icons, we'll find many examples of poorly implemented long shadows, or long shadows implemented as if they are just the result of something, as if they are just a natural byproduct that should not be considered. But I would encourage people to consider how they can use the shadows to create dimension within the object, how they can line up with shapes and be cast in meaningful and in intentional ways rather than arbitrary. Examples of tricky long shadow placement in which I deviated from this would be the example of this raised object, which would desire a full long shadow, making a very weird transition from a fading shadow to a new one. I opted to just open up the gradient and create this kind of large swath of shadow. In this situation, the conventional way to raise it would create a strange gap there and provide an uncompelling in addition to the icon. And so I had it pull from this arguably raised element, which bisected the eye diagonally. In this situation, if all four shapes of this tag overlapped, this one would create an awkward shadow, which would then flip to this shadow. So I opted to just tuck that tag under and avoid the catastrophe. In terms of avoiding catastrophes, this long shadow would be inconsistent with the angle of the bow and offer a strange presence or emphasis on this area of the icon, which is unproductive and unbeneficial. So I opted to abandon it. I encourage people to abandon long shadows if they don't serve us. For this angle, for this icon, the angle of the swoosh would be abruptly ruined by the long shadow, and so it was abandoned as well. I encourage you, as I've done, to utilize the icon set to create compositions, to use the system icons as building blocks, as a visual language, to keep a similar aesthetic and modify them heavily whenever appropriate. And then another subtle practice by some of Google's icons is to, as you move from a dark to a light, to not just go up in brightness, but to shift the hue slightly, moving from an indigo to a light blue, or to just throw in strange colors. So in this, I've moved from purple to blue, and in this move, I've moved from a yellow-green to a blue-green. Deviations from the guidelines are exciting and interesting. In this situation, we have a self-overlapping icon. In this, the foreground element has a dimension over itself, so it's kind of a slinky shape. In this, I've used strong shadows and some gradients for the ripples. In this one, to create synergy between an Android and iOS icon, I've used a gradient between them. Two by developers at Google use a translucent shape and a use of dimension that is typically not present to the icons, and this exploring with semi-transparent shapes. Using spot colors as symbolism, like we described, having both raised elements and secondary elements to add information and context. That's what I've got to say about them. In the time remaining, we can look at Figma, and if anybody has questions or would like help doing certain things within the design software, I'd be happy to help. And if there are questions, I can answer those at this point. All right, yeah, thank you. I think we've got a few moments remaining, and in that time, you're welcome to work on icons, and I'm going to walk around, or if anybody has questions, you can raise your hand and I'll answer them.